Osez le féminisme, c'est une association généraliste, donc on traite différents sujets sur l'égalité femmes-hommes et la lutte contre les violences masculines faites aux filles et aux femmes. On est une association de sensibilisation, donc pas comme le NI, une association d'accompagnement de première ligne. Nous, on essaye de faire changer les mentalités pour transformer la société à travers du plaidoyer politique, à travers des interventions en milieu scolaire avec les jeunes, à travers des événements, des campagnes de communication et de sensibilisation sur divers sujets, donc qui vont là de la campagne présidentielle où on analyse le sexisme ou pas, mais souvent le sexisme des programmes des candidats et des candidates. Par exemple, le plaisir féminin, l'éducation à la sexualité féministe. On a écrit récemment un livre à ce sujet. Également, évidemment, la lutte contre le système porno-prostitueur. Et puis, récemment, on s'est mis aussi à se saisir du volet juridique, légal, pour toujours se battre pour l'égalité femmes-hommes. Et donc, on a le concours Miss France pour dénoncer et la distribution de ce... Voilà, donc ça, c'est le travail que nous avons mis. On est trouvable, évidemment, sur Internet, on a un site Internet, nos réseaux sociaux, etc. N'hésitez pas à nous suivre si vous en avez envie. Et je vais laisser la parole, il me semble, à Claire. Oui.
Pareil, bonsoir à toutes et à tous, bienvenue également. Donc, je suis Claire Pidet, je suis présidente du mouvement du NI. Alors, le mouvement du NI, pour celles et ceux qui ne connaîtraient pas ou peu, c'est une association qui a maintenant une vingtaine d'années, donc une vieille association qui est présente à travers des délégations départementales, donc dans près de 25 départements, et dont les actions sont, donc le mouvement du NI, c'est vraiment d'abord une association de terrain. Donc on travaille auprès des personnes en situation de prostitution et avec elles, pour les accompagner, les accueillir, les rencontrer d'abord, les accueillir, les accompagner. Et c'est un accueil complètement inconditionnel, quel que soit voilà, là où elles en sont de leur parcours, quelle que soit leur demande d'accompagnement, d'aide qu'elles peuvent exprimer au moment où elles viennent nous voir. On est aussi une association qui agit en sensibilisation du grand public, en formation, donc des travailleurs et des acteurs sociaux au sens large qui peuvent rencontrer des personnes concernées par la prostitution dans leur pratique professionnelle. Nous travaillons aussi beaucoup en prévention auprès des jeunes, dans les collèges, dans les lycées, dans les universités, et puis nous avons aussi toute une activité de plaidoyer politique qui a été notamment extrêmement active pour obtenir la loi de 2016. Et donc voilà, sur ces actions-là, évidemment, on rejoint, souvent nos actions se rejoignent avec celles de l'OLF, par exemple. Et je suis vraiment particulièrement heureuse d'accueillir Rachel Moran ce soir. Rachel, nous la connaissons bien, ça fait déjà un bon moment qu'on se connaît, et on a toujours été extrêmement frappés, touchés par la puissance de sa parole. À chaque fois qu'elle a pu intervenir, que ce soit dans des événements internationaux européens ou parfois même pour nous venir en France dans des événements organisés par le mouvement du NI, elle a une parole très juste, elle a une parole très forte, et on est évidemment excessivement heureux que son livre soit enfin traduit en français et nous soit présenté. Voilà, pour le mouvement du NI, la parole des survivantes est cruciale. La parole des personnes prostituées est vraiment quelque chose que l'on met en avant depuis toujours. Dans notre revue Prostitution et Société, dans chaque numéro, il y a des témoignages de personnes prostituées. Tout notre travail se base sur la parole des personnes prostituées, sur ce qu'elles ont vécu. Et donc la parole des survivantes est vraiment pour nous quelque chose d'extrêmement important et d'extrêmement fort. Merci Rachel.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Alors moi je suis Emma Siby, la coordinatrice du plaidoyer de CAP International. CAP International, c'est la coalition pour l'abolition de la prostitution internationale. C'est une coalition qui rassemble 35 organisations de terrain et fondées par des survivantes de la prostitution et de la traite, qui sont issues de 27 pays. Et ces associations viennent en aide à près de 16 000 victimes de la prostitution et de la traite à des fins d'exploitation sexuelle dans le monde. Donc chez CAP, notre travail, il est dirigé, il est guidé par les survivantes de la prostitution. Et pour nous, il est crucial que leur parole soit entendue, car leur parole est irréfutable. On est donc vraiment ravis, et c'est un honneur aujourd'hui de soutenir la parution en français du livre de Rachel Moran, L'enfer des passes. Donc L'enfer des passes, on l'a tous lu chez CAP, et c'est un livre brillant qui vous plonge dans les réalités vraiment du système prostitutionnel, qui déconstruit tous les mythes qu'on entretient également sur le sujet. Et donc on est vraiment ravis d'accueillir et de soutenir ce soir Rachel, notre amie et alliée de longue date. Merci.
Donc, bonsoir à tous. Donc, on peut accueillir Rachel. Je vais commencer en français rapidement et après je poserai les questions à Rachel en anglais. Merci d'être là si nombreuses et nombreux. Merci à la Cité Audacieuse de nous accueillir ce soir. C'est vraiment aussi quelque chose de très important qu'on puisse être là ce soir dans ce haut lieu du féminisme francilien ou parisien. Merci aussi à Kevin et aux éditions libres qui ont traduit Paid for en français sous le titre L'enfer des passes de la prostitution. C'est peu dire qu'on l'attendait depuis de nombreuses années. Et donc, en fait, nous sommes vraiment très heureuses, émues aussi, et honorées de vous recevoir, Rachel, de te recevoir. Rachel Moran est donc une survivante irlandaise de la prostitution. Elle est aussi la fondatrice de l'association internationale de survivantes Space International. Elle a été une des artisanes de la loi abolitionniste qui a été votée en Irlande en 2017. Et donc, je vais enchaîner sur l'anglais maintenant pour qu'on puisse rentrer dans le vif du sujet, le sujet de l'enfer des passes. Donc, je vous montre la version irlandaise, the Irish version. And Rachel likes really very much, I know, the cover of the French version, L'enfer des passes. One of your favorites, I think. And so, yes, more than it's almost been 10 years now since you wrote the book, I think. Like tonight, Rachel would like to mostly exchange with you. She likes the Q&As with the public, so I will ask a few questions, maybe read some extracts, and then let you talk as much as you can. Rachel, thank you for being here, and I will say also that you're here in Paris tonight, but you're in France for a whole week, and on Wednesday you will be in Lyon, on Thursday in Montpellier, and on Friday you will be in Toulouse. And then you come back to Paris before going to Brussels, where next Monday you will meet with European institutions, and we'll also have a webinar with one of your fellow survivors from Spain, Amelia Tiganus, who also wrote a book, La Revuelta de las Putas, and it's two very, very strong books journeys through prostitution and also strong political advocacy. So since Paid For, you've been going throughout the world, you've been testifying, analyzing, thinking. It's a whole commitment that we should all be very thankful for, that you have to make the system of prostitution known for what it is and not for all the myths, and for the survivors' voices to be heard. As other women that are maybe in this room tonight, Rosa Michel was supposed to be here, but she is unfortunately sick, so she couldn't be with us. So you're living for the reality of prostitution to not be denied anymore, and that the violence of prostitutors is finally recognized for what it is, which is paid rape. Now it's been more than 7 years that the book has been written. We have been waiting very long for this translation. So my first question, Rachel, tonight is, and it's what you say in the beginning of the book, why in the beginning of the 2010s you decided to take your pen and write this story, which is, I suppose, a very difficult thing to do. Well, it's a journey in itself to have to tell all the stories.
Firstly, you hear me? Okay. Before I answer, thanks so much for the question. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the Nous, avons, to CAP, to Foundation Cells, and to all my supporters here in France. It's so important that you're gathered here this evening. It's so important to me personally to see all your faces and to feel and to see the reality of the support that I have and that we have as a movement, as women, because there is nothing that I can imagine that would be more painful than to try to tell these truths and for them to fall on deaf ears. And the evidence is here in this room that I'm not talking to deaf ears, so thank you all so much. To answer the question, why did I write the book in my own name specifically? I was asked that question just in recent days on a webinar event by a lovely young feminist called Moran, who I've come to really like in the short time that I've known her. And my response to her, and I guess this is kind of important from the point of view that people think that this is an act of great courage, you know? And of course there's courage involved in doing something that's frightening. But the truth of the matter for me is that, as I said to Moran, the only thing more frightening than writing this book would have been not writing it. The idea of dealing with a deathbed regret, because that's what it would have been. The idea of meeting your end and knowing that you hadn't had the guts to do the one thing, you know, in your whole life, the one thing that matters the most. I couldn't deal with that. So in a very real way, writing the book was a response to fear rather than courage. And I didn't feel that I could tell the truth and stamp any name on that truth but my own.
Okay, so I did it in several parts. There is the part where you're telling your own story, and your own story is first that you're living on the streets at 14, you're homeless at 14, and then you're entering not willingly the system of prostitution at 15, and so you have been knowing what in France at the moment we call prostitution des mineurs, which is underage prostitution, which today, this very day, there was a plan presented by the government to fight against underage prostitution. They announced 40 million euros for it. They announced some things to try to do some more education in schools, etc. But there are still two issues that concern us. Is that that puts it out of the continuum of prostitution, which doesn't change because you're 17 or 18 or 19. It's a continuum of male violence against women. And also the fact that it really has difficulties to address the responsibility of the perpetrators in prostitution. That's the prostitutors, sex buyers, and the pimps. And they said that they wanted to fight that, but we don't really know what they're going to do. If they're going to do something in a country where the law is abolitionist, so where prostitutors could be severely criminalized, especially when it's for underage prostitution, and which is not really proper term, I suppose, and you can react on that too. And so, in the book, you explain what's the difference for the sex buyers. What's the difference? Why do they see underage women, not adults, hear about it, and is it, on the contrary, what they're looking for?
Well, that's about a half a dozen questions all rolled into one. So I'm going to do my best. I think, no, they're all important. I'll do my best. Look, I think sometimes we get, as we say in Ireland, lost in the weeds. I don't know if you have a similar expression here in France, but in Ireland we say you can get lost in the weeds in a conversation or a debate in particular. And I think we're really lost in the weeds here in these conversations to a large extent, because we keep talking about the particulars, the peripheral issues, the offshoots of the main problem. The issue here is simple for me, and I think that very often we get into these layers and levels of complexity, and I think they're hurled at us too. I think we're supposed to get lost in the weeds, as it were. The reality for me is that this is not the forced abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement that I am involved in, and that many of us in this room are involved in, is not the forced abolitionist movement in history by any stretch. The most recent abolitionist movement to our own was the abolitionist movement that was kicked off in Britain in response to several centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. And what that movement did, and that movement ran for over 100 years, as we know, before they were finally, generations of people, one after the other, were finally able to collapse the system of slavery. What they did was, and let me try to collect my words here, apart from the fact that it was enormously important, as we all know, they attacked it at the root. What they did was, they, from the start, they conceptualized collapsing the framework of chattel slavery by making it illegal for one person to own another person, to buy another person, to sell another person, so that it was the person involved in the commercial exchange from the position of power. It was their power that was taken away. And that's how chattel slavery was collapsed. Now, we keep on getting lost in the weeds from the point of view that we're not focusing the energy back where it belongs. So what you're talking about, Sandrine, this issue where we're talking about, the minors, the under 18s, we're going to give X amount of, I think we said 40 million euros to try and to stop the abuse of these minors. Well, that's absurd. I'm sorry, but that's absurd. I was in prostitution for 7 years from I was 15 until I was 22. So my life was lived during those 7 years in an almost equal balance before and after the age of 18. And I can tell you, and I've said many times in public, that there was no magical fairy dust sprinkled on my head at midnight on my 18th birthday that turned my situation from something dreadfully painful and psychologically harmful into something that was all perfectly fine and ordinary consensual work. That didn't happen for me, and it doesn't happen to any woman. And I have felt very sad at times, speaking publicly, when I'm sitting alongside of some of my sisters who got into prostitution in their 20s or their 30s or, God forbid, their 40s. I know one woman who got into prostitution at 40 years of age and was actually told to her face by somebody who would identify herself as a feminist that it was her own fault at 40 years of age. Nothing to do with her poverty, nothing to do with the situations that drove her to make that desperate step, but that it was her fault because she was 40 years old. And that is so hurtful to me, because I know how very easy it would have been, had my life progressed on the track that it was on for another decade, another 2 decades, people would have looked at me just the same way. they would have said to me, and in fact people have said to me, the economy was buoyant in Ireland in the 90s. Why didn't you just go and get a job? You know, okay, we can understand the first couple of years, but why didn't you just go and get a job? So I guess I'm kind of going the long way around answering your question. I'm probably getting lost in the weeds myself at this point. But the point is this. I think that these are diversions. I think that until we attack it at the root, we take away the political power of the people who are exercising that power in a harmful, damaging way. And that's where we have to keep our focus. We cannot shift our focus away from that for a moment.
On a un problème avec la traduction, le créateur n'entend pas.
Apparemment, à travers Zoom, la traduction n'est pas entendue. Okay.
We're hearing too much the microphoning translation to the French, so I don't know what to do.
We need to move forward apart, maybe.
But it's coming through speakers. Maybe I should move away, but I can't because of that computer.
If I move, is that okay?
We'll try to find out. So I'll have to look at you though, because I can have to see your body in English too. Je vais prendre le.
Derrière là-bas.
Okay. Sorry for those technicalities. Désolé pour les technicalités. Il y a toujours une solution. Ok, je me lève. Ok.
J'en profite pour dire un grand merci à Isabelle pour la traduction. C'est un sacré boulot. Okay, so that was a transition, what you said on the other chapter that I wanted to address, which is how to, or those who are really responsible for the system of prostitution, it's the prostitutors. I don't know if the term is okay for you. And so in the book you are talking a lot about them, of course, about your experience with them, and I think when I read Paid For in English, donc l'enfer des passes, 7 years ago, it was really striking to me, and it's the same that I've been reading in Prostitution Society's testimonies, the way men who have been involved in the system of prostitution speak about what they have been experiencing from prostitutors. And there is a word that is coming back regularly and all the time is disgust. So can you a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in any human interaction that you have, there'll be common feelings, sensations that you experience, and we all know this, and we can relate to it in a multitude of ways. You know, it's invigorating to have a shower, you know, it's refreshing to drink a glass of lemonade. Well, it's disgusting to have your body used by a stranger. And it's disgusting, it's revolting, you're filled with the sensation of revulsion and many other feelings combined. It's a very psychologically not only harmful but deep experience in terms of the psychology of it. It's very, very deep. I was sitting in Italy a couple of years ago before all this COVID-19 craziness, and I was talking to crowd around about the size of this one. And I felt this sense of frustration the evening before, just thinking about how do I make them understand? Like what do I say? Because you cannot convey this very easily in words, and I know that because I remember my pre-prostitution self, and I know that I would have found it very, very difficult to grasp what I was listening to if somebody had been trying to explain this thing that I'd never experienced. And I see this on social media every single day, and I'm sure we all do, those of us who are very engaged in this issue. I had a man pop up on my Twitter feed just today talking about how he bought women and quite merrily, happily bought women, and he was a passionate advocate for the full decriminalisation of prostitution, which of course means the full decriminalisation of men like himself and of pimps. You know, I was listening to all of this and I was thinking it really is only in a world like this, as this world is right now, that he can straightforwardly say this. He was talking about how he would use his own name in a country where he was fully legal and above board in doing what he was doing, and that he would conceal his identity in a country where he wasn't. And I don't think this fool understood that this was the best argument for the Nordic model I've heard in quite some time. But I didn't bother, you know, to engage him. The point of all of this is that that sense of revulsion and disgust that you feel is wrapped up always in this experience, and also in the difficulty of conveying this experience. I never responded to that man, and I have no intention of doing so because I'm not prepared to put myself through that at this point in my life. 5-6 years ago I might have done. I'm not doing it today. I know that I deserve better than to have my mind filled with that kind of filth. But I suppose I'm struggling to get to the nub of what it is that I'm trying to say. Is that the revulsion and the disgust never leaves you. And a big part of the reason why it never leaves you is because you have sold more than sexual access to your body in prostitution. A lot more. You've sold your right to articulate what it is that you feel and why, what was done to you, how harmed and why. You've sold all of that. And I guess for me, I really feel that disgust be damned, I'm taking it back, whether I sold it or not.
Thank you for this answer. I would like, before maybe, unless someone already wants to ask a question or make a to go a little bit further with the prostitutes. I'm going to read a small extract. Just wait a second. The first extract. I'm going to read it in French, but Isabella has it to do, and then so you can speak about this categorization of the men who were buying sex. You made it. Le sentiment de domination qu'un homme ressent lorsqu'il paie une prestation sexuelle ne s'éteint quasiment que s'il demande à satisfaire son désir d'être dominé. Et même dans ce cas, comme je l'ai dit, il jouit toujours du contrôle que lui confère son statut de client-payeur. Les clients prostitueurs que je rencontrais dans de très grands hôtels ou chez eux, dans des maisons extrêmement luxueuses, quand je travaillais out call. Alors, il y a une note qui explique, dans le jargon du monde de la prostitution, ça signifie que ce sont les femmes prostituées qui se rendent chez le prostitueur. Donc, dans ces maisons extrêmement luxueuses, les clients que je rencontrais dans ces maisons étaient parmi les plus compliqués qu'une femme prostituée puisse avoir. Ils pensaient que tout leur était dû et leur condescendance était proportionnelle à la somme qu'ils payaient. Le message était clair. Je viens de te donner 200 livres, donc je vais faire avec toi tout ce dont j'ai envie et tu n'as rien à dire. Chez certains, ce comportement n'était que le reflet de leur arrogance et de leur inhumanité. Chez la majorité d'entre eux, ils prenaient de toute évidence un malin plaisir à m'humilier au sens sexuel, à faire en sorte que je me sente impuissante, que je ressente et que je comprenne que j'étais là pour une seule et unique raison, pour que mon corps serve de réceptacle à leur sperme. So you're talking in these very strong words of the prostitutes, and you explain that you had 3 kinds of all that express their domination, but some are not exactly the same as others.
Well, yeah, there are categories of men, and I think that they can be broadly put in those categories. And say categories of men. I'm talking, of course, about the men who find sexual access to women, which is not most men in this country or most countries, thankfully. You know, there are, and they can be grouped in those ways. And what I find really fascinating is that when you look at and you listen to all of this nonsense that's going on in the media, you know, the Brooke Magnantis, the happy hooker, you look into all of this and you see how popular it is. And it's kind of funny, I mean, in the way that you very rarely see the men in these kind of representations of what prostitution is, this pop media representation. You don't see much of the men at all. The focus is, as it always is, no matter where the conversation is at in prostitution, squarely focused on the women. And so in this, you know, fantastical representation of what prostitution is, you see a lot of high heels and lipstick and fishnet stockings, and you'll certainly see very expensive hotels and restaurants, and you'll see the trappings of luxury, capitalism writ large, all over this. And that's and it's perceived and received as glitzy and attractive and fun and alluring, and I think above all desirable for the woman. And I think that's the really interesting thing. It's promoted as desirable for the woman. Now, the actual reality of prostitution, if you were to take this nonsense and flip it into its opposite, which is exactly what prostitution is desirable for the man. And that's exactly what it is. And that's what it was for me in all of the 5-star hotels, by the way, because I spent those 7 years in prostitution in every environment that you can imagine. And there were reasons for that, because prostitution has its history like anything else. To give you a very, very brief history of the 7 years of prostitution in Ireland, what was happening between 1991 and 1998. Some of you may have heard the phrase Celtic Tiger. So what happened in Ireland, that was very, very suddenly, in the first just couple of years after I got involved, a lot of money was flooding into the country. A lot of apartment blocks were springing up everywhere. All of a sudden, men had more money. But in 1991, the men were generally doctors and dentists and politicians and the judiciary. By 1993, 1994, we were dealing with electricians and plumbers and working class men. So things changed very rapidly in Ireland, and the demographics of prostitution, as far as the men were concerned, changed also. So that was something that was, I want to hook it back to the question again, because I've circled too far. Can you give me the...
Okay, it was about the categorization.
Oh, yeah, the categorization of men. So you could categorize the men who pay to use us in all sorts of ways. But I think the important thing to remember is that we're talking here about class and social status. Because even the man who's at the lowest rung of the social ladder, if he's going out spending 30, 40, 50 euros to pay to use the body of a woman who can't afford to put a sandwich into her own mouth, he's obviously higher on the social ladder than he is, and he's abusing that social and economic power. In all cases, in every case I've ever seen, we're talking about the abuse of political power. And that's the central core element of what prostitution is. And I think when we get into categorizing men, which we can do, as I said, in all sorts of ways, who use women in prostitution, you can do that by their behavior. You can do that by the particular types of sadistic behavior that they want to involve themselves in and enact upon women's bodies. You can do that by their attitudes, you can do that by their opinions, but I think the most important way that we can categorize this subcategory of men is by the way that they abuse their political power as men in a sexist society.
Okay, is there anyone you can ask questions in French? Vous pouvez poser des questions en français. Does anyone want to discuss with Rachel?
It's always really slow to get started. There's always this push, and everybody is kind of thinking, will I put my hand up and will I be the first one? But the moment one hand goes up, the ball starts rolling really quickly. And this is my favourite part of every event. I love the Q&A because I love the often very illuminating questions that are asked and the way that it forces me to think. And so yeah, I really appreciate and welcome your question.
Alors, qui se lance? Ah. Il y a quelqu'un au fond. Non, il y avait quelqu'un avant. Peut-être.
J'avais une question sur le parcours de sortie de la prostitution de Rachel. Si elle pouvait un peu nous dire finalement comment est-ce que ça s'était passé, est-ce qu'elle avait eu quel soutien elle avait pu avoir et peut-être quels enseignements elle en tire aussi pour d'autres femmes qui sont actuellement. Merci.
That's such an important question. Thank you so much. For me, I had no support, and I wasn't aware that there was even support on offer. And there actually was at the time support on offer, but I had no idea, and I still have no idea what that consisted of, because the organisation Ruhama was set up in 1989. 2 years before I got into prostitution. So in 98, when I was getting out, I don't know where their services were at. I don't know, what they would have had to offer me. But had I even been aware at all that there was such a place, Ruhama is a Hebrew word that means renewed life. And if I had known that there was a place called Renewed Life that was offering support for women in the sex trade, I would have been in the door so fast I couldn't tell you. But I didn't know, and bearing in mind we were living in a different time, there was no internet, it was just a different reality, much harder to make word of mouth spread back then, without all of the social media and that kind of stuff that we take for granted now. So no, I wasn't aware of any support and I didn't get any, but it's a difficult question to answer from the point of view that I think that what I was lacking most, like to find out, to talk about what women need would be to look at what I was lacking, obviously. And we'll all have different lacks as women, and we'll have different lacks also depending on what position of our lives that we're in. So I would have needed different supports in 98 than I would have needed in 95 versus 92, etc. What I think is very important is that there's a multiplicity of services for women, because if you have a broad range of services, a woman might need 3 or 4 of them, or she might need 1 of them, she might need all of them. It depends who she is and where she's at that particular point in her life. The further along the road of prostitution I was, the more services I needed. I needed addiction services, I needed You know, if I was to go back to school, then I certainly needed education, but I would have needed childcare and so on and so forth. Whereas if I had been caught at the very beginning, like in the opening weeks, well, I just needed a roof over my head. That's all I needed, you know. But the deeper a woman becomes involved, entrenched in prostitution, the more difficult it is for her to get out, for her as an individual to get out, and also the more difficult it is to help her. Because the longer she's involved, as you know, for frontline service provision, you're dealing with a much more complicated and difficult case as time goes on. So I guess that's the one message I would give: have as broad a range of services as possible, and also regularly to ask the women themselves, because nobody will tell you with more clarity what's necessary than the women who need it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so that leads me to one question I would have asked maybe at the end about the abolitionist law in Ireland today. In France now we are struggling to have the law implemented and implemented in a whole way, that all the very important pillars of the law are implemented and with the necessary means and such in place. So what's the situation in Ireland since the law was voted in 2007?
Well, I'll come back to that in a second, but the question that you asked me earlier on when you were talking about the 40 million euros that was targeted at eradicating prostitution in minors, well, that question really alerted me to something, which is that the French authorities could not be serious about eradicating prostitution in all of its forms all across the board. By serious, I mean really committed, you know, cracking down on this, shutting this thing down. Because if they were, they wouldn't be segmenting off the minors. Because if they were interested and seriously committed in shutting the whole thing down, they wouldn't need to specify the minors in this way. Sadly, in Ireland, we're in a similar situation. We spent about 2 years, I would say, kind of floundering as a nation. Not much happening. The law's on the books. The punters all know the law's on the books. You know, but not much happening. And then, thankfully, in the third year, we started to see a pick up of pace in the enforcement of the law. And we also saw last year the SERP research, that's the Sexual Exploitation Research Programme from University College Dublin, that was published, and that made a major impact in the Irish Times and elsewhere across the Irish media, and people could finally see with their eyes what we have been pleading with them to listen to us about for years in that country. So we're in a kind of a similar spot. We've both got our law, you know, 1 year after the next. We're still struggling within a system, I believe, that doesn't see women of equal worth and value, because if it did, the law would have been robustly implemented from the day that the ink was put on the page, because this is not years late. It is not even centuries late. These legal models are millennia late, you know, and we're still waiting for them to be sincerely and robustly implemented in Ireland and France and Sweden, for that matter, and everywhere else that I've seen. Because what we're looking at here is not only a lack and a failing and kind of a lukewarm implementation process, we're also seeing a very big failing on behalf of the governments in terms of how much money they're prepared to inject into exit services and strategies for women. I'm living in a country where there's more money given to greyhound and horse racing every year than there is to the multiplicity of services for women, not just women exiting the sex trade, but domestic violence shelters and the rape relief shelters and the whole of the women's, you know, movement issues taken together don't amount to as much as sporting issues. So it's it's intensely frustrating, it's deeply saddening, and I have no reason to believe that this is going to change overnight. We have to keep pushing, we have to keep pressing, and we have to convince the governments of the world that we are in fact of greater value than a racehorse or a greyhound.
Yeah, this is so true. Is anyone, quelqu'un pour poser une question? Oui.
Je vais poser ma question en anglais. Thank you, Rachel, for being here. Thank you so much. The testimony is so important. I wanted to ask you, how do you manage to have a dialogue with women in prostitution who oppose abolition, who have a different viewpoint, who say that it's their choice, and how can we as activists have conversations with them? And in a related topic, how would you answer? What would you say to people who let's say this, we often even hear that we're speaking instead of, we don't listen to survivors, we speak instead of them, which is the basis of the argument of a lot of people who oppose abolition, and I was wondering what you thought about that. Thank you.
Can you just hold on to the mic for a minute, because I want to kind of just check back with you, because it's kind of a two-part question. First of all, what I'd say is that they never say that to me when we're alone. Women will spit and spew all of that kind of bile in my direction, and very forcefully, when they're on Twitter or when they're standing up in a public gathering like this one. I've had that happen many times. Women get up screaming and throwing things and, swearing and generally embarrassing themselves. I've had a lot of that, but they never say it when we're alone. And this I've noticed. Outside of the venues, we come face to face, we have a dialogue one-to-one. They don't do that when we're alone, because they know better. They know I'm telling the truth. And more than half the reason why they're angry with me is because I'm telling truths that they don't want to be known. And this, we need to understand, is that, look, when somebody stands up and tells the truth that you don't want to be known because it pertains to you as an individual and it hurts you as an individual, it hurts you, it pertains to you, it's a part of how you're living, you don't want it to be a part of how you're living, and here this person is standing up telling the whole world what you're afraid to tell yourself about yourself. Of course they're angry with me. I would have been angry with me. I probably would have given myself a punch in the face. So I'm not surprised by any of this, It's not to say that it's easy. I've been dealing with it for 10 years. There's nothing easy about this, but I understand where it's coming from. So much calmer about it, knowing the place where it's coming from, and the reason why it's coming, and the psychology behind it. Now, there was a second part to your question, and I just don't want to miss that. Can you repeat that for me, please?
As activists in favor of abolition, we often hear everyone speaking the voice of people who are actually what this is about. And obviously, we try to listen to survivors, but I find it difficult sometimes to answer to this argument. And I was wondering if you have, obviously you're hearing a testimony, so you're showing that that's wrong already. But
you see, there was a reason I didn't want to miss the second half of that question, and it's because it's important. You need to assert yourself forcefully as a member of society. You have a right not to want prostitution to exist in your society. You have a right to walk through the world as a woman and not want to be part of the class that's been designated to be bought or sold should the circumstances of your life happen to place you there for you or your sisters or your dogs. You have a right to assert that forcefully as a woman, because you're part of a sex class. And this you have to understand is very important. We can't move away from the politics. We can't, and they say, oh, we're sex workers, listen to sex workers, nothing you say matters. So what? Under decriminalisation, the pimp can buy the apartment next door or rent it and move in and have women in and out and in and out, profiting off the backs of women next door, you and your family and your children, and you can't ring the police because they're doing nothing wrong. You have a right to assert that you refuse to live in that society. So my advice, and I'm getting kind of hot under the collar about this, we're all residents of somewhere. If the pimp set up in my street, you'd be visiting me in Mountjoy prison, right? Because I assert my right as a citizen in Ireland not to have to live in that cesspit. And I really feel that we need, as citizens, even if we know nothing of prostitution in terms of our own personal experiences, we have a right to refuse that in our society. And actually we have an obligation. And if more people had refused it in mine, I might not be sitting here now.
Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup Rachel pour ce que tu viens de dire, et bien sûr que moi je partage ça complètement. Je pense que tout le monde a le droit de sa place en tant que citoyenne, citoyen, d'exprimer le choix de société que nous voulons. Néanmoins, je crois aussi que des paroles comme la tienne, les paroles des survivantes, on le sait, ont une force qui sera entendue d'une manière différente que la nôtre. Il sera toujours... You want me to speak in English?
Oh no, I'm just thinking, I was waiting for the translation and then I thought...
Est-ce qu'il faut qu'on commence?
Oh, go ahead.
Ouais. Donc je disais... C'est bon? Okay. Donc effectivement, je pense que des paroles comme la tienne auront toujours une force bien supérieure à la nôtre, parce que c'est comme ça, parce que ça sera mieux entendu, parce que même si je suis d'accord avec toi, je pense que tout le monde a le droit de porter cette parole-là. Et donc ça m'amène à ma question qui est, toi tu as créé ce réseau Space International pour permettre justement à des survivantes de s'exprimer. Nous, ce que nous constatons en France, c'est que, je le disais en introduction, le mouvement du Nous, nous donnons la parole aux personnes concernées à travers notre revue Prostitution et Société. Et on a des témoignages très forts dans chaque numéro. Néanmoins, ce sont des personnes qui ne veulent pas parler publiquement. Et ça, évidemment qu'on le respecte, et évidemment qu'on le comprend. Et on ne va jamais les pousser à ça. Mais on aurait besoin de personnes comme toi qui osent prendre la parole et qui osent affirmer et dire ce que tu dis. Donc ma question, c'était ça, comment est-ce qu'on peut favoriser la prise de parole de survivantes? Comment est-ce qu'on peut créer un environnement qui soit suffisamment sécurisant pour elles et pour qu'elles osent parler, tout en sachant le stigmate extrêmement fort sur les personnes qui ont vécu la prostitution.
You know, I talked a little bit earlier on about the similarities between what we're dealing with now and the transatlantic slave trade in the United States and the British pushback against it. And I'm going to ask Sandrine to read a little, just like a paragraph here. And I'm hoping that my English-speaking eyes can find this paragraph in French. Let me try. It is. It's dans la préface. Yeah. So it's where I'm talking about the attempt by the British by the slave traders to say we call prostitution slavery. Yeah, and I think so. Read the last few words. Those few words. I don't want to, is there somewhere in here where I'm talking about where they said that they were trying to call the slaves assistant planters? Can you see that there?
C'est quand elle parle de travail du
Is that
sexe
in
et
that
être
paragraph?
planteur.
Can you read that
Yeah,
paragraph?
okay.
Thank you.
Lorsque les propriétaires d'esclaves du XVIIIe siècle virent la légitimité de leur violation des droits humains contestés, ils tentèrent de redéfinir le statut des personnes asservies en les qualifiant d'aides-planteurs et affirmèrent que si cette redéfinition avait l'effet escompté, on n'entendrait plus vitupérer contre l'esclavage les grenouilles de bénitier, les poétesses au cœur tendre et les politiciens myopes. Leur supposition aurait pu être juste, mais heureusement ce ne fut pas le cas. Nous avons ici affaire à la même ruse linguistique dans l'expression travail du sexe qui gagne en vigueur, en pertinence et en puissance chaque fois que nous l'employons.
So my point is that you must be brave. You must be brave because there'll be all sorts of tricks that you're up against. And the big trick I see right now is listen to sex workers. Oh, only sex workers have a right to speak about the material condition of their own lives. But you see, this is not just about the material condition of their own lives. This is about society. It's about what sort of society we want and what sort of society we're leaving for our kids. And more importantly, what sort of society we're leaving for the most vulnerable of our kids, who are likely not our kids, but the children of people that we don't know and we likely never meet. You know, people from the lower working classes where I come from in Dublin, the disadvantaged working classes, people with mental illness and addiction in the house, people with all sorts of misfortunes. We're abandoning them when we listen to this, listen to sex workers. Bullshit, and excuse my language, but it is bullshit. And it's outrageous bullshit, and I'm sick of listening to it. And it's amazing to me too, by the way a woman's testimony evaporates into nothingness on the day that she stops being used by men. How come if we were to listen to sex workers, and this is so important, why is my testimony meaningless and worthless in the eyes of these people? But I know I could rant on about this for quite some time, but what I'll say to you is I do believe we don't have the right to let these people steer the conversation. And we certainly, I hope, won't allow our brain cells to be blown out our ears by listening. I mean, who said at the time that, and this is why I'd asked Sandrine to read that short passage, at the time when we had the horror of chattel slavery going on in the Western world, nobody said, oh, listen to the slaves. How do they feel? Are they happy? Are they comfortable? Is it a nice thing? I mean, so you're okay being a slave. And what if the majority of enslaved people had said, well, you know, life after 250 years of confinement is terrifying to me, so I think I'll stay where I am, thank you very much. If people had listened to that, had that been the message, we'd still be confronted with that horror to this very day. So my point is, we don't have the right not to be brave and to confront this. And I know I'm repeating myself here, but I know that you're up against something very difficult, which is being charged with being a bully and not listening to the people that this concerns. And it's difficult when you're up against a horrible charge like that. You're going to be called the bully, you're going to be called the bigot, you're going to be called anti-women, you're going to be called every kind of insult, because that's all designed to dissuade you from what it is that you're trying to do. But what I'm saying to you is, you don't have the right not to be brave on this one. This is not going to happen today or tomorrow or next week or next year, not next decade neither. It might be 100 years from now before we stamp this thing out. But we don't have the right to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe it gives me the opportunity to really rephrase part of the question to say, how can we, in our frontline NGOs, best support the voice of survivors?
I guess it would be to gently encourage, and I do mean gently, I've made some mistakes in my own campaigning. I've made mistakes that I would dearly like to be able to get in a time machine and go back 10, 11 years and, and alter. And of course I can't do that. And I think certainly the biggest of those mistakes was working with women who were not ready. Because when you have a woman, and I don't mean that in any kind of an insulting way, by the way, or a disparaging way towards the women concerned, but when you are out of prostitution 12, 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years, you're not ready. You're not ready. And you're nowhere near ready. You've got far too much healing to do left. And I know that the timeline of healing will be different for different women, and it will depend on all sorts of different things. Obviously, the length of time that they were involved in prostitution and the degree of trauma that they experienced while in prostitution will be big factors. And you can't measure that in any woman. And the reality is it's very difficult to measure it in yourself. So I guess the first thing I would say would be gently encourage women to write if they want to, and only if they want to, never to push them. Anonymous articles, maybe to have anonymous closed door meetings with politicians again if they want to. But be very careful to not allow yourself to create a situation or to be drawn into a situation where you're dealing with a full frontal out in the public view with women who are just not ready, because it's damaging for everybody and it's very unfair to the women themselves. But there are ways of gathering that kind of testimony that are unobtrusive, that are not as harmful, and anonymising as far as you possibly can is really, I think, a very wise strategy.
Merci, merci beaucoup pour ces remarques. J'avais une question. Nous étions sans doute très nombreuses à rêver qu'après le mouvement MeToo, il y aurait cette mise en cause évidemment des violences sexuelles dues évidemment à la domination masculine. Et je fais partie de celles qui pensaient que ça influerait sur le regard que notre société portait sur la prostitution. J'ai en tête ce qui vient de se passer en France avec la dénonciation par 8 femmes journalistes d'un célèbre animateur sur ses perversions sexuelles, sur ses agressions sexuelles. Et malheureusement, je n'ai pas entendu. Alors, le personnage est nommément cité, il va être voyagé de tous, mais bien sûr, je ne sais pas, mais enfin, en tout cas, il est né au pilori. Mais au-delà de nommément comme ça, nommer quelqu'un qui du coup va décharger peut-être que les autres, à aucun moment nous n'avons entendu la notion de violence sexuelle due au patriarcat, à la domination. On n'a pas fait le rapprochement entre les deux. Et par rapport à la prostitution, je trouve que ça relève de la même façon de faire. C'est-à-dire qu'un homme de pouvoir se permet d'agresser sexuellement parce qu'il a du pouvoir et se croit tout permis. Et un homme peut se permettre de payer, donc il va se comporter de la même façon. Et je regrette profondément que personne jamais ne fasse, enfin à part les associations bien évidemment féministes, ne fasse le lien, en tout cas dans la presse, Libération qui en général qui normalement n'est pas très favorable à notre loi, enfin à la loi française, par exemple a fait cette belle enquête auprès des femmes journalistes, mais à aucun moment il ne parle justement de la domination masculine, du fait que les hommes, parce qu'ils ont du pouvoir ou de l'argent, peuvent se permettre d'agresser, de violer des femmes. Et ça, c'est dommage qu'on n'arrive pas à faire ce parallèle. Je pensais que ça aiderait à lutter contre la prostitution. Et en fait, non, on a du mal encore à faire bouger cette idée-là. Qu'est-ce qu'elle en pense ?
I think that it begins and ends with the language. I think it always begins and ends with the language. And I think that, unfortunately, and this is true in Ireland as it is in France, as it is in Spain, everywhere, we've not yet nailed the language. And that's a problem. I mean, that's a big problem. The front cover, the title of my book has been different in the different nations that it's been published in, because paid for, well, it doesn't have the same connotation at all here, I'm told, in France. So as it's gone from country to country, the title has shifted. The title in Italian is paid rape. Now that was never going to work in Ireland, because in Ireland we have a very sharp, clear concept of rape, and I assume it's the same here in France, if not worse, culturally. Rape as being something that couldn't possibly be paid for, because rape is something that is such a perfect opposite of consensual, right? So that's the sexualized idea of what rape is. So you couldn't possibly pay for something that was not consensual. Now the problem there is the term consent itself. The problem is the way that we have used the term consent in connection with sexuality and sexual behavior. We never should have allowed that to happen. The heart and soul of sexuality is mutuality. It's not consensuality. That's a whole different thing. Can you imagine being in bed with your lover and saying, oh, do you consent to my putting your hand, you know, here, and can I put my hand there? And can you imagine the mechanical nature of that kind of nonsense going on in your own bed? You know, I mean, you'd be out of the relationship, I'd imagine. The point that I'm trying to make is that we keep on making linguistic missteps, and I believe that it's because of the mistakes in the language that the other mistakes, the big mistakes, the political mistakes, the legislative mistakes then follow. I think that the moment you make a linguistic misstep, you make a cultural error, and that everything flows on from that. So my advice always with questions like this is to pull back, bring it back to the language, because until we get that right, nothing else is going to work.
Yes. Is there any other d'autres questions? So I will go further on this to say to you that if there is all the chapters in the book are to be read, of course, but there is one that I think is just that I would read as a whole if I could now. It is the one on the myth of normalization. You debunk a lot of myth, and then you talk about this total imposture, I forgot the word, fraud of the ideology of sex work, and really everything that you say in this chapter is to be read and published everywhere, and you think that when you've read this chapter, how come that anyone could otherwise? So I don't know if you can sum it up or say in basic word that basically prostitution is neither sex nor work.
Well, I wish you'd sent that question on to me yesterday, because I would have read the chapter and then I would have had much more to say. The normalization. Well, the way that prostitution is normalized is, again, getting back to what I just said, it's about language. Sex work is the most obviously normalizing term that I've yet come across. Of course, it's an absurdity, because prostitution is neither sex nor work. As Sandrine has just pointed out, you know, it's not sex because there's no mutuality, and it's not work because it's degrading in and of its nature. You know, and somebody made this point just yesterday on Twitter. You know, people always get into over flipping conversations when you're talking about prostitution. And the woman had said, and I had quoted her, when you're in McDonald's, you're not the meat. When you're in prostitution, you are the meat. And that was a very, very astute quote, always stuck in my head. You know, I guess the thing about all of this is that we need to look at what's happening in all these conversations, because behind everything that a person says when they're debating with you, there's an intention. And you'll notice when you watch carefully the threads of these conversations and listen to what's been said, whether it's on Twitter or, you know, on a television debate or anywhere else, even conversations, neutral people, you know, sitting around the place, there is a sense of intention, you know. I think I'm going to need to sit down and tease this one out even for myself and write about it at length before I feel that I'm fully competent to talk about it in public. Because I feel that sometimes there's an unintentional sense of intention, if you know what I mean. People get it into their heads that this is right, this is true. Because I've heard it so many times, it must be right, it must be true. And then they will communicate that same thing and they'll repeat it in conversations. And very often they're talking nonsense. And what's very illuminating for me is when I figure out when I've been talking nonsense. Because there's certainly been times when I was talking nonsense and I didn't even know it. I remember butting heads with a woman once about whether or not, because there was a real push on, we had to find a term, we had to agree on a term, and I was fighting tooth and nail to make sure that sex work wasn't there, but that I would accept prostitute. Sorry, sex worker wasn't used, but I would accept prostitute. And this American woman was fighting tooth and nail, arguing with me, saying we could accept neither. We were getting on each other's nerves, to be honest with you. This was a long time ago. And she was getting on my nerves and I was getting on hers. And I ended up sending her, because it was a conversation with many feminists on an email thread. And I ended up sending her a private email and I asked her, could we talk? I wanted to know why she was so bald-headed about this. Turned out that she was right and I was wrong, and I've never used the term prostitute in that sense again in my life. And sadly for me, the conversation happened after paid for it was published, before it. And I guess that's what I mean when I say that you can move on and you can evolve politically, and you should, you know. But it's, to me, it all comes back to the language, always. The sad thing is that we have people who even on our own side of the political fence, are just not. I don't think that we're always, all of us, committed enough to keeping the language straight, because I really do believe that the moment we lose that, we've just lost everything.
Yeah, and when you wrote page 4, so as you said, things would have evolved on some terms you were using, but I will just read a little sentence in the third extract. After you cite this sentence with MacDonald, you say l'expression travailleuse du sexe est une arme rhétorique pour normaliser la prostitution. Nul doute que certains seraient ravis si elle entrait dans le langage courant, mais je n'ai pour le moment encore entendu personne l'utiliser pour parler d'une femme prostituée, à moins d'y avoir un intérêt personnel. Au sein de notre communauté, cette expression nous faisait bien rire. So, okay, that wraps up everything you said, but what is terrifying me is that
but I haven't a clue what you're quoting is the thing. I'm so sorry. I forgot to put my earpiece in. That's
okay, so I'm going to try and translate.
No, it's fine. Just give me a few keywords and I know.
Just you said that the sex work expression was a weapon to normalize, but then and you said no doubt that some would be very happy if it came into the common language, but until now I've never heard it used to talk about a woman prostitute, and unless they had a personal interest among our community, this expression was making us laugh. But okay, my question is, 10 years later, unfortunately, I get the impression that it is now used everywhere. So, how do you explain that? What do you mean? That just there?
I think that there's a half a dozen different explanations for that.
Sorry about my not so good questions.
No, it's fine. They're very interesting questions, actually, Sandrine. This is the kind of thing that you sit down and write a lengthy article in response to these questions, and sadly we just can't crunch it in. You know, yes, this is what's happened. This word has spread like a virus, and to my mind, it is a form of virus. It's like a social virus, because when you have a lie circulating at top speed across the world, and being pushed by George Soros's billions, you know, and all of this is wrapped up with people are profiting massively from prostitution, and this is the thing that sickens me. The people who are not getting their hands dirty, you know, there's people profiting enormously from prostitution. They're not pimping, they've never seen the inside of a brothel, they sure as hell have never laid down in a brothel's bed. I'm talking about the academics, the NGO professionals, all of these people who are connected in this nasty big international web, and they're actually profiting like crazy off prostitution, and they've never had to do none of the donkey work, none of the dirty work, or nothing. It's just, it's sickening and it's crazy.